Dakota Territory, February 1878. The sky is the color of iron, flat, endless. The kind of sky that doesn't care what happens underneath it. Pull back farther, miles of frozen prairie, no trees, no shelter, nothing moving except the wind which moves constantly and without mercy. Closer now, a single road cutting through the white, and on that road a girl, 16 years old, dragging a trunk through 14 below cold with her bare hands. She stops, not because she's tired, not because she's lost. She stops because she's looking at something. A creek bank half a mile ahead, a wall of frozen earth 9 feet high facing south. Her breath makes smoke in the air. She looks at that bank the way her father once looked at raw timber, like she can already see what it's going to become. She picks up the trunk. She keeps walking. The morning Orvin Odson threw her out the thermometer, read 14 below zero. Not cold enough to kill you fast, just cold enough to make you think about it. Mabry. Edson stood at the edge of the road with a trunk that held 2 dresses, a wool blanket, a stub of candle, $4 in coins, and her father's hammer. The hammer was the important part. She was 16 years old, 3 days past 16 to be exact, and she was standing in the kind of cold that turns your breath into smoke and your fingers into something you stop being able to feel around the time you start wondering if you made a mistake. She had not made a mistake. Her stepfather Orvine had, her mother Hester had, the woman who started the rumor, Orvine's sister, a narrow-faced woman named Prudence, who had been watching that hammer since the day Mabry's father was buried. She had made the biggest mistake of all, because Mabry knew why she'd been thrown out, and it wasn't what Orvin said it was. It was the hammer. Carveth Mall had built things his whole life, chicken coops, root cellars, a stone smokehouse behind the Pennsylvania farmhouse that was still standing when they sold the property. He built the way some men prayed quietly, carefully, like the work itself was a conversation with something larger than himself. And when the fever took him in the spring of 1874, he left Mabry 2 things, the hammer and everything he taught her about how the earth works. Not everything Prudence wanted, not the land, not the savings, just a hammer and a dead man's knowledge. Prudence had spent 4 years watching that hammer sit on the shelf, 4 years smiling at Mabry across the Sunday table, 4 years planting seeds, until the morning she told Orvin she'd seen Mabry behind the stable with a railroad worker. She hadn't, but the seed was planted, and Orvin's mind once set, stayed set. So there was Mabry, on a frozen road in Dakota Territory, February 1878. $4, 1 blanket, 2 dresses, 1 candle, and a hammer that a dead man had left her because he believed she was worth leaving something to. She dragged the trunk half a mile before her hands went numb. She did not cry, not then, not for a long time after that. What she did was start calculating. But before we get to the calculations, before we get to the creek bank and the frozen ground and the thing that changed everything, I want you to understand something about that winter, because most people, when they imagine Dakota Territory in 1878, they picture something romantic, wide open sky, prairie grass, the promise of land. What they forget is the cold. -14, when Mabry walked that road, was actually a gentle morning. By January, this territory would see 40 below with wind, 40 below with wind, and no trees for miles except whatever scraggly cottonwoods happened to cluster along the creek beds. Families burned through a full winter's wood supply in 6 weeks. Men went out to check on livestock and didn't come back. Children died of cold in houses that looked perfectly solid from the outside. A frame house, the kind Vorden Hasp sold lumber for the kind every sensible settler was supposed to build, kept you alive if you fed it constantly, if you had wood, if you could get to the wood, if the wood was dry, if the stove held, if the walls didn't gap where the boards had warped. A lot of ifs, for people with no margin of error. Mabry had $4 and a hammer. She had no margin for anything, which is exactly why what she did next matters. The town of Bismarck in February of 1878 was not exactly welcoming to a 16-year-old girl dragging a trunk down the main road. People noticed. People always notice in a small settlement. They noticed the trunk. They noticed the red in her face from cold and the set of her jaw that said she wasn't going to explain herself to anyone who hadn't earned the explanation. They noticed and they went back to their business, which is what frontier people do. Survival takes up most of your attention. Strangers are someone else's problem. The exception was Dessa Rude. Dessa ran the dining hall attached to the Northern Pacific Depot, a long, low building that smelled permanently of coffee and salt pork and whatever grease had accumulated in the stove joints over the past decade. She was 52 years old, a widow going on 8 years, and she had the particular stillness of a woman who had already seen most of what life intended to show her and had decided to keep going anyway. She was standing in the doorway when Mabry dragged the trunk up the steps. She looked at Mabry, looked at the trunk, looked at Mabry's hands, which were the color of old brick from cold. Can you carry dishes without dropping them? Yes. 35 cents a day, one meal. There's flour sacks in the back room you can sleep on for now. She stepped aside to let Mabry through. That was it. No questions about where she'd come from or who'd put her out or what the story was. Dessa Rude had been put out herself once. Not the same way, not for the same reason, but the look on a girl's face when everything has been taken from her, that look is always the same regardless of the details. Dessa recognized it, and she stepped aside. Mabry worked the breakfast and supper shifts, carrying plates and washing up after. 35 cents a day, one meal, flour sacks. She was good at the work, fast and quiet and careful about not breaking things. The kind of worker who doesn't need to be told something twice and doesn't take up more space than necessary. But every night after the supper dishes were done and the stove was banked and Dessa had gone upstairs, Mabry sat at the end of the prep table with a stub of pencil and a piece of old newspaper and did arithmetic. 35 cents a day, 7 days a week if she worked them all, $2.45 a week, starting from $4. Cheapest boarding in Bismarck was $1.50 per week, and that was a room in a house where 6 other people were already sleeping. She ran the numbers 3 different ways. They came out the same each time. She couldn't afford to stay in Bismarck, not for long, and she couldn't afford to leave. The trunk sat against the back wall with the hammer on top of it. She looked at the hammer while she did the math. Her father's voice, not loud, just present. The earth is a slow thinker, Mabry. It takes a long time to get cold and a long time to warm up. That's not a weakness. That's a promise. She'd been 9 years old when he said that, standing next to him while he dug out the root cellar behind the Pennsylvania farmhouse. He'd reached down and pressed her small hand flat against the earth they'd just excavated. Still warm, even in October. You feel that she'd felt it. The ground remembers summer longer than the air does. Everything up here, the air, the wind, the frost, it changes fast. But down there, the earth holds. It's slow, but it holds. She looked at the hammer. She looked at the newspaper in front of her with its columns of numbers. She thought about Apple Creek. She'd seen the creek bank 2 weeks earlier on a Sunday when she'd walked the long way back from church, not because she was feeling devotional, but because she needed to think, and walking helped, and also because she was avoiding the Hasp family pew, which required a detour of approximately 3 blocks. Apple Creek ran west of Bismarck, maybe 3 miles out. Nothing remarkable about it. A working creek, the kind that existed to give livestock something to drink and to flood its banks every spring for the entertainment of people who had already dealt with enough. But along the south-facing slope of the bank, something had happened over years of flooding and erosion. The water had carved, had cut, had taken the soft material and left a vertical face of compact glacial clay and till standing nearly 9 feet high, facing south. Mabry had stopped walking when she saw it. She hadn't been looking for a building site. She hadn't been thinking about construction. She'd been thinking about the cost of firewood and whether her boots were going to last another 2 months. But then she saw the bank, and the voice again, south-facing slope holds heat. The sun hits it all day. The earth below the frost line never freezes all the way through. You build into a south face, you're borrowing heat that's already there. She stood there in her mother's old boots' feet, going numb inside them, and she saw the whole thing, 8 feet deep into the bank, 10 feet wide, front wall built up from the bank itself, stone at the bottom, cottonwood framing above, roof made from poles she could cut for free from the grove upstream, sod on top of that. Total cost of materials, if she was careful, somewhere between $8 and $10, maybe less. She walked home faster than she'd arrived. The county recorder's office smelled like dust and old paper and the ambition of a territory that was still figuring out its own rules. Mabry went on a Tuesday morning before her shift. She asked about the land along Apple Creek, the stretch west of town, where the bank had eroded. The clerk, a young man with ink on his fingers, who seemed surprised to be asked a specific question by a girl who appeared to be under 30, said he'd have to check. He checked. Unpatented territory. No pending claims. She could file a homestead application when she had the money for the filing fee and had established residency. She asked what counted as establishing residency. He said living there predominantly. She said thank you. She walked to her shift at Desse Rude's dining hall, put on an apron, and carried plates for 6 hours without mentioning any of it to anyone. She was not naive. She knew that an unpatented claim was not a deed. She knew that a 16-year-old girl with $4 had very limited legal standing in Dakota Territory in the year of our Lord, 1878. She knew that the moment anyone important found out what she was planning, there would be opinions, many, many opinions. She intended to have the hole dug before the opinions arrived. She bought the nails from Vorden Hasp's lumber yard on a Saturday in early March. 50-penny weight, 6-penny nails, $50 worth. Hasp himself was at the counter, a large man, well-fed in a way that communicated prosperity with the confident manner of someone who had been right about most things for most of his life. He'd built 17 houses in the Bismarck area, he would tell you without much encouragement. Frame houses, proper construction, the kind of shelter that stood up to Dakota winters and didn't embarrass the people inside it. He looked at the nails Mabry had requested, looked at her. What are you building? A shelter. What kind? She hesitated for just a moment, not long enough for him to notice, she hoped, just long enough to decide what she was willing to give away before she had proof. Earth shelter, into the creek bank west of town. He set down the bag of nails and looked at her, the way a doctor looks at a patient who has just described a symptom that suggests they don't understand what's wrong with them. You mean a dugout. I mean an earth shelter. That's a dugout, miss. He picked up the nails again, weighed them. I've seen a fair number of those attempted in this territory. You know what I've seen fewer of? She waited. Successful ones. He set the nails on the counter between them. The moisture alone will rot anything you put down there inside 2 years. That clay soil, when it gets wet in spring, it moves, it shifts. Ceiling comes down on you. Even if it doesn't collapse, you're living in a root cellar, dark as a tomb, damp as a riverbank. You'll be sick by April. He wasn't wrong about the dugouts he'd seen. He was wrong about what she was building, but she didn't know how to explain that yet, because she hadn't built it yet, and all she had was her father's voice and the warmth she'd felt pressing her hand into Pennsylvania earth 20 years ago, and a bank of glacial clay along Apple Creek that had been holding itself vertical for decades without asking anyone's permission. "Thank you," she said. "I'll take the nails." He sold them to her, and she could feel him watching her walk out the door, certain she was making a mistake. She kept walking. On the 3rd of March, 1878, Mabry Eadson began digging. The ground was still frozen solid for the first 6 inches. She'd known it would be, so she did what her father had taught her. She worked with the material she had instead of fighting it. She built a small fire directly against the bank, let it burn for an hour, then moved it along and started digging in the thawed section while the next section warmed. Then another fire, then more digging, small controlled fires that didn't announce themselves too loudly to anyone passing on the road half a mile away, because she wasn't ready for the announcement yet. She worked before dawn, and she worked after her shift at Desi's, which meant she was sleeping 4 hours a night on flour sacks in a cold back room and waking up before the sky was light to go dig a hole in frozen ground with a spade and a pickaxe she'd borrowed from the general store owner in exchange for 4 extra hours of work on Sunday. The blisters came in the first week. The palms of her hands opened and bled and dried and opened again. Daisy noticed on a Tuesday. She was wrapping Mabry's hands in a strip of linen, not asking, just doing, when she said, "What is this fool project you've gotten yourself into?" Mabry explained. "All of it. The bank, the slope direction, the drainage principle, the earth's heat, the fires to thaw the ground, the math on the materials." She laid it all out the way her father had taught her, practically in terms of what the earth would and wouldn't do and why. Dessa listened, finished tying off the linen, sat back. "Dugouts," she said, "are for desperate men who don't know any better, not for girls who ought to be finding some better situation." It was the most words Dessa had said to her since the morning she'd stepped aside to let her through the door. "I don't have a better situation," Mabry said. "I have $4 and a hammer." Dessa looked at the hammer sitting on top of the trunk in the corner of the back room. "That was your father's." "Yes." Desi was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that isn't absence of thought, the kind that's presence of something she wasn't ready to say yet. "Go get some sleep," she said finally. "You're on the early shift tomorrow." Norcut Fane rode past on a Wednesday in the second week of March. He'd homesteaded 2 miles upstream from where Mabry was digging, had been on his land since 1872, had the calluses and the weathered face to prove it. He knew this territory the way people know things when the territory has tried to kill them several times and they've managed to still be standing. He pulled his horse up at the top of the bank and looked down at the hole Mabry had carved, maybe 3 feet in by then, with the fire rings visible on the frozen face ahead of her. "You understand," he said, "that we get 40 below out here, For weeks at a time, she looked up at him. He was backlit against a pale sky. Big man on a big horse, speaking from a place of genuine experience with winters that had bent men who started out considerably more resourced than she was. "How deep does the ground freeze?" she asked. He blinked. It wasn't the question he'd expected. 6 inches, maybe 8. "I'm going 8 feet. He sat with that for a moment. She waited. She'd learned young that silence is more effective than argument if you're patient enough to hold it. He didn't have a response that covered it. She could see him looking for one. His horse shifted. He looked at the hole, looked at the fire ring on the bank face ahead of her, looked at her hands, which were wrapped in Dessa's linen and holding a pickaxe at a very businesslike angle. He rode on. It was the first conversation she'd had where a skeptic hadn't been able to finish his case. It wasn't much, but she filed it away. Callum Prest caught her after Mass on a Sunday in late March. He was the Catholic priest who had known the Mole family since they'd arrived in the territory in 1875. He was 58 years old, white-haired, with the kind of face that had spent decades listening to people's worst moments and had arrived at a permanent expression of careful concern. He was not a bad man. He was not trying to harm her. He genuinely believed in what he was about to say. That was almost worse in some ways. "I've heard about your project," he said. "I imagine you have. I have concerns." He folded his hands. "A young woman, alone, 3 miles from town, in a structure that even if it holds through the summer, will leave you isolated in winter in a way that could be genuinely dangerous. The structure will hold. You can't know that yet." He was right. She couldn't. Not yet. "What happens if you're injured?" he continued. "What happens in December when the road to town is impassable for a week? I can help you find a proper arrangement. Perhaps with the Granberry family, they have young children they need help. It would be Christian charity on both sides." She looked at him, stood in the cold outside the church door, her father's hammer in her coat pocket, where she always kept it, now a habit she'd developed without quite deciding to, and she looked at this good man offering her a reasonable solution to a problem she had not asked him to solve. "Thank you, Father," she said. "I appreciate your concern." He waited for the next part. "I'll be fine," she said. He walked away with a small sigh that said he would be praying for her, which she supposed was the best either of them could do at this point. Pride is one sin, he'd said once to someone else in a sermon she'd heard 2 years ago, but foolishness is worse because it affects more than just yourself. She'd been thinking about that sentence ever since, turning it over, testing it against what she knew, because here was the thing nobody wanted to say directly. If she moved in with the Granberry family and helped with their children, she would be warm, she would be fed, she would be safe in exactly the way Father Prest meant, and she would have nothing, no claim, no ground, no structure she'd built with her own hands. She would be dependent on the Granberries' continued goodwill, which could be withdrawn any time it became inconvenient, and then she would be exactly where she was right now, except a year older and no closer to anything she could call hers. She was 16 years old. She had been dependent on someone else's goodwill her entire life. She knew exactly what happened when that goodwill ran out. She knew because she'd been standing on a frozen road with a trunk and a hammer when it ran out. Pride is one sin, maybe, but there was something on the other side of pride that Father Prest didn't have a word for. The thing that makes a person dig into frozen earth before dawn because the alternative is to remain at the mercy of people who can decide on any given morning that you're not worth the trouble. It wasn't pride, it was something quieter than that, more necessary. She kept digging. By the first week of April, she had the main room excavated, 8 feet deep into the south-facing bank, 10 feet wide, 9 feet front to back. She'd slope the floor at 1 inch per foot. Toward the entrance, water would drain out instead of pooling. She'd angle the sidewalls and back wall inward at roughly 10 degrees, not perfect, just close enough that the earth would bear its own weight and stay put instead of deciding to come down on her head. Every evening she tamped the walls with a flat board, compressing the clay until it stopped giving under pressure. Dakota clay mixed with glacial till heavy dense, the kind of material that turns hard as fired brick once you compacted it properly. Her father had told her this. She hadn't believed it until she tested it. Her father had been right. She dug a channel along the east wall, 8 inches wide, 10 inches deep, running the full length of the dugout from the back corner to the entrance, sitting below the main floor level. Any moisture that seeped through the back wall would find its way into that channel and flow out the door instead of pooling on the floor. Then she dug a second drainage channel outside the entrance, a V-shaped ditch that would catch spring snowmelt and redirect it down the slope and away from the structure. Gravity would do the rest. It always did. Water found the lowest point. You couldn't argue with it. You just had to be smarter about where you put the lowest point. The Romans had understood this. She'd read about it in a book her teacher had loaned her 2 years before Orvin pulled her out of school to do more useful work around the house. The Romans had moved water across hundreds of miles, using nothing but gravity and slope and the knowledge that water given the option will always go down. She was using the same principle on a smaller scale in Dakota at the age of 16 with a borrowed pickaxe and blistered hands and 4 hours of sleep a night. The front wall came next. She couldn't afford cut lumber for all of it, so she used creekstone for the lower 4 feet, heavy flat pieces she'd been carrying up from the bank 2 at a time, resting between loads, always calculating how many more she needed before the light failed. She mortared them with a mixture she developed over 2 weeks of testing, 2 parts clay, 1 part dried prairie grass, enough water to make it workable. The grass was Dessa's suggestion, oddly enough. Not construction advice. Dessa had walked out to see the site on a Sunday afternoon, stood at the edge of the hole with her arms crossed, and said nothing for a long time. Then, the mud swallows' nests on the underside of the depot eave. You seen those? Mabry had seen them. They use grass in the mud. Whole thing dries harder than either material alone. Desi walked back to town without explaining why she'd come. Mabry tested the mixture. Dessa was right. The mortar dried hard as plaster and held the stones together without cracking. She filed that away too. The observation without the lecture, the help that didn't announce itself as help. The upper portion of the front wall she framed with cottonwood poles she cut from the grove upstream, leaving a space for a door and a window opening roughly 2 feet square. The door she bought from Hasp's yard, a damaged pine door someone had ordered and rejected because the frame was slightly warped. $1.20. She paid without comment. For the window, she had no money left for glass, so she went to Desse and offered 2 weeks of Saturday morning laundry work in exchange for 4 small panes salvaged from a building that had burned the previous autumn. Dessa considered this. "That's a fair trade," she said. She handed over the glass without making it into anything more than a transaction, which was exactly the right way to do it. Mabry set the panes in the window opening with the clay grass mortar and sealed the gaps with pine pitch. she'd collected from the cottonwood grove. It wasn't beautiful. The opening was slightly uneven, and one pane was cracked along the corner, but it let in light, and it could be seen from inside as a small square of whatever the sky was doing. That mattered more than she'd expected it to. The roof was where everything could go wrong. She had watched 2 dugout roofs fail in her life, both in the territory, both during spring thaw, both for the same reason. Poles laid across the opening sod, piled on top, and nobody had thought hard enough about what happens when 2 feet of wet sod decides it would like to be on the floor instead of the ceiling. She cut 23 cottonwood poles, each about 7 inches in diameter and 14 feet long. She debarked each one with a draw knife she'd borrowed and rubbed them down with the linseed oil and tar mixture from the hardware store. That treatment would buy her a few years against rot. Not forever, but a few years was what she needed right now. She laid the poles across the opening 8 inches apart, running from the back wall to the front stone wall. Then she did something that no one in the dugouts she'd seen had thought to do. She'd been saving newspapers for 2 months, getting old editions from the dining hall, from the general store, from anyone who'd finished with them. She had a stack 3 feet high. She laid those papers across the poles in overlapping sheets, an entire layer of newsprint between the poles and what was going above them, a barrier, a slowdown for water, an insulating layer that cost nothing because it was made from things people were throwing away. Over the newspapers went a layer of dried prairie grass, packed tight. Then came the sod. Cutting sod was the hardest physical work she'd done in her life, and she had done some hard physical work in her life. She used the spade to cut strips 3 feet long and 12 inches wide, slicing down 4 inches where the root mass was thickest. Each piece weighed 30 pounds. She'd cut 4, carry them to the roof rests. Cut 4 more, carry rests. She laid the first course with the grass side down, the second course perpendicular to the first, so the seams didn't line up and water couldn't find a straight path through. 2 layers, full coverage, 1 week of evenings and Sundays to complete. When it was done, she stood at the bottom of the bank and looked up at it. It looked like a piece of the hillside that had grown a door, like the earth had just decided to include a room, like it had always been there and she'd only uncovered it. She moved in on the 6th of May, 1878. The trunk, the flour sacks Desse had given her, not loaned, given without comment. A stub of candle, the hammer. The first night was cold and dark and smelled like wet clay and cut grass and something underneath that's something older, the smell of earth that hasn't seen air in a very long time. She lay on the flour sacks and listened to the silence, which in a dugout is a different kind of silence than you get anywhere else. Not the silence of empty space, the silence of surrounded space. The earth was on 3 sides of her and above her, and it pressed in without being oppressive, the way a heavy blanket is not the same as being buried. She thought about Father Prest, about Vordenhasp and his list of reasons this wouldn't work, about Norcut Fane on his horse with no answer for how deep does the ground freeze, about her mother standing at the kitchen window with her face turned away. She thought about Orvin, who had taken everything and gotten a hammer he couldn't use, and a daughter who was no longer in his house and would never ask him for a single thing again. She thought about Prudence, about the 4 years of smiling across the Sunday table, about how a lie planted in the right soil grows exactly as well as the truth does, and sometimes faster. She thought about her father. The earth is a slow thinker. She fell asleep with the hammer next to her hand on the flour sacks. She woke to something she hadn't expected. The night had dropped to 38 degrees. She'd seen the frost on the grass when she came in, cold enough for ice, cold enough that even in May the unprepared would have been reaching for everything they owned to pile on top of themselves. Inside the dugout, it was 55 degrees. She hadn't lit a fire. There was no stove yet. There was nothing generating heat except the earth around her, which had been holding the warmth of the previous afternoon and releasing it slowly through the night, the way her father had said it would, the way she'd felt it in her palm at 9 years old in Pennsylvania, pressing her hand against excavated earth in October and feeling summer in it still. She sat up on the flour sacks in the near dark and held her breath. 55 degrees, without a fire, without a stove, without anything except the ground doing exactly what her father said it would do. She had been right, not because she was special, not because she was smarter than Hasp, or braver than Fane, or more faithful than Father Prest, because she had paid attention to what was actually true instead of what people were certain was true, because a dead man had pressed a little girl's hand against the earth and said, "Feel that," and she had felt it, and she had not forgotten. She sat in the near dark in May with frost on the ground outside and a hammer beside her hand, and for the first time since the morning, she'd been put out with $4 and everything she owned in a trunk. She felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for a long time. Not joy exactly, not triumph, something quieter. She had built this with borrowed tools and salvaged glass and newspapers and prairie grass and clay. She had built it for $9.45 and the knowledge her father left her, and it worked. Outside Bismarck was waking up to another May morning, cold and bright and indifferent. Inside the earth, Mabry Eidson was already warm. Summer came to Dakota like it always did, fast, hard, without apology. By July, the temperature outside was hitting 95 degrees most afternoons. The dining hall was unbearable. Desse sent the kitchen staff home early, twice in 1 week, because the heat off the stove combined with the heat off the prairie, combined with the heat radiating through the walls, created something that was less like a kitchen and more like the inside of a bread oven that had been left running by mistake. Mabry walked back from her shift in the blazing afternoon heat, crossed the 3 miles to Apple Creek, ducked through her low door, and stepped into 68 degrees, 68, while the rest of the territory was melting. She stood just inside the entrance for a moment every time she came in, the way you pause at the threshold of something that still surprises you, even when you expected it. The cool rose off the earth walls and wrapped around her like water, like shade that didn't move when the wind moved, like the world had a second temperature and you only found it by going underground. She had a rope bed frame now strung against the east wall, shelves she'd built from scrap lumber fitted between the support poles, a small table, 2 chairs she'd traded dishwashing hours for, and a stove cracked across the top but functional that she'd bought off a family heading back east for $3. They'd been leaving because they couldn't take another winter. She'd used their leftover wood to test the stove's draw. The draw was good, and when she put her hand flat against the clay wall in July and felt the cool, steady press of it, she thought about Hasp, who had listed 4 reasons this would fail. She thought about Fane, who had no answer for her question about frost depth. She thought about Father Prest, who had offered her a better situation. None of them had been in this room in July. None of them knew what it felt like to be the coolest person in Dakota Territory while the rest of the territory was suffering. She was not vindicated yet. That wasn't the right word. Vindication required an audience, and she hadn't earned one yet, but she was cool, and she was learning that being right in private was its own particular kind of satisfaction. Here is what nobody tells you about building something with your own hands. The building doesn't end when the structure is done. The structure is only the beginning. Then comes the living in it. Then comes the watching it perform in conditions you planned for and conditions you didn't. Then comes the adjustments, the small corrections, the moments when you realize you got something slightly wrong and have to decide whether to fix it now or wait and see if it matters. June, July, August, September. Mabry watched her dugout, the way her father had watched his root cellar with attention, the way you watch a living thing that can't tell you what it needs, so you have to figure it out from how it's behaving. She watched the way moisture moved along the east wall when it rained. The drainage channel caught it and directed it out exactly as she planned. No pooling, no seeping into the floor, a quarter cup of water on the worst days, which she wiped up with a rag and thought good. Working, as designed. She watched the temperature, noted it, started keeping a record on the back of old newspaper pages. Outside temperature, inside temperature, date weather conditions. July average, outside 91, inside 67. August outside peak 95, inside peak 69. September outside at dusk 52, inside at dusk 63. The earth was doing exactly what it was supposed to do, absorbing heat during the day, releasing it at night. Nothing from her except attention. It was extraordinary. It was also, she was beginning to understand, extremely inconvenient for certain people. Vorden Hasp came by in August, not to apologize, not to ask questions. He came because he happened to be doing business near Apple Creek, checking on lumber he'd sold to a homesteader upstream, and he rode past the site and he looked. He stopped his horse, looked longer. The sod roof had settled and greened over the summer. Prairie grass had taken hold across the top of it. The whole structure looked like the hillside had just grown an entrance and a window, like it had been there for 20 years, like the earth had digested it and made it part of itself. Hasp looked at it for a long time. Then he rode on. He didn't say anything, not to Mabry, not to anyone she heard about, at least not right away. But she'd been watching from the entrance when he stopped, and she saw the set of his shoulders when he looked, the way a man looks when something is not what he expected it to be, and he is deciding how he feels about that. She filed it away. Then she went back inside where it was 68 degrees and ate her supper. October came, and with October came the rain, not the usual kind, not the steady soaking kind that came through every fall, the kind that settled the dust and topped up the wells and smelled like something getting ready for winter. This was the other kind, the 4-day kind. It started on the 17th of October, and it did not stop. Not a hard driving rain, worse than that in some ways. A persistent, heavy, relentless downpour that found every gap and every low point and every weakness in every structure in Bismarck and the surrounding territory and made them known. Hasp's lumber yard flooded. He lost 2 cords of premium board lumber to standing water on the second day. Norcut Fane lost a storage shed. Roof came off on day 3. He found his seed grain 3 fields over and salvaged maybe half. 3 families in town had their cellar spaces filled with runoff coming off the hills. One family, the Weavers, had to move everything to the upper floor of their frame house and wait it out. Apple Creek rose from its normal 2-foot depth to nearly 8 feet. The water came to within 30 yards of Mabry's entrance. 30 yards. She sat inside and watched it through her small, cracked window, and she did the math. 30 yards. the creek would need to rise another 2 feet and shift approximately 25 degrees in direction to threaten her drainage ditch. Not impossible, but not happening in this rain. This rain was already slowing on day 4. She could see the color of the water changing from the brown of disturbed soil to something cleaner. Inside, dry. Not perfectly dry. The back wall wept, a thin film of moisture that found its way into the drainage channel exactly as designed. She checked the floor, traced the channel with her eye, watched the water travel along the low interior toward the entrance and disappear. She wiped up a 1/4 cup of water with a rag. That was it. The entire 4-day storm had deposited 1/4 cup of water on her floor. She was making supper when Father Prest appeared in her doorway. He was soaking wet. His cassock was dark with rain, and there were mud spots on his boots that went up to the knee. He had clearly been walking in this weather to check on people, which was exactly the kind of thing Father Prest would do, because whatever else he was a man who showed up. He looked at her, looked at the interior, looked at the drainage channel along the east wall, its function visible to anyone who knew to look for it. "You had trouble?" he asked. "A 1/4 cup of water." He looked at the channel again. "That's what runs the water out," she pointed. "The angle of the floor directs it to the channel. The channel carries it to the entrance. The exterior ditch takes it downhill." He looked at all of it for a long time. "I was wrong," he said, "about at least one thing. It was not a full apology. It was not a declaration. It was a precise, careful man acknowledging a precise, careful fact. One thing, not everything, not yet." But it was the first time anyone had said those 3 words to her since February, and they mattered more than she would have admitted to anyone. "Winter is still coming," he said. He said it gently, not as a threat, as a reminder from a man who genuinely believed she needed to hear it. "I know," she said. He stood in the rain a moment longer, looked at her cooking pot on the stove, the shelves with their organized supplies, the temperature in the room, which was notably warmer than the outside air even without a fire going, which he could feel on his wet face and hands. He walked back to town in the rain. She watched him go. Then she went back to making supper. She had already been thinking about winter. Since August, actually. Since the first time she'd looked at her firewood pile and done the math and felt something tighten in her chest. Here is the problem with firewood in Dakota Territory. You need a lot of it. More than seems reasonable. A full winter in a frame house could take 8 cords or more depending on the house and the winter and how cold you were willing to let yourself get. Mabry's dugout would need considerably less. She'd calculated that, and she believed the calculation, but she still needed wood, and wood cost money, and money was something she had in limited and carefully tracked supply. She'd spent October gathering from the cottonwood grove and the scattered elm and ash stands she'd found along the creek. Dead wood mostly. She'd borrowed a cross-cut saw from the hardware store owner and sectioned the logs into lengths that would fit her stove, hauled them back on a hand sled she'd built from scrap, stacked them outside the entrance 6 feet high, 8 feet wide, covered with an old canvas tarp she'd found abandoned near the railroad tracks. By early November, she had what she calculated was enough. That was when the first snow came. November 12th, just a dusting, 2 inches that melted by afternoon, but it soaked the canvas, and when she went to get wood that evening, she found the outer layer wet, not just damp, wet through the way canvas gets when it doesn't repel water anymore because it has forgotten how. She brought the wet pieces inside to dry by the stove. They hissed and smoked. They gave off maybe half the heat of dry wood and twice the frustration, and it meant she was always one day behind burning wood that was still damp while trying to dry the next day's supply in a space that was not large enough to hold 2 weeks of firewood without taking over most of the living area. She reorganized, tried smaller piles under the tarp. The tarp was too far gone. She'd need a new one, and Hasp sold tarps for $1.20 each, which she did not have to spare without cutting into reserves she did not want to cut. 3 nights of smoky half-heat and damp wood, and the knowledge that this was not sustainable. On the 3rd night, she sat at her table and looked at the drainage channel along the east wall. It was empty, had been empty since October. It had done its job in the storm, and now it was just sitting there, 8 inches wide and 10 inches deep and 9 feet long, doing nothing. She looked at it for a long time, 20 minutes maybe, the kind of sitting still that isn't inattention. It's the opposite of inattention. It's paying so much attention that the outside of you goes quiet so the inside can think. 8 inches wide, 10 inches deep, 9 feet long. She got up and measured it again anyway, just to be sure. 9 feet, 8 inches across, 10 inches deep, split cottonwood, sectioned to 16 inches stacked in that channel. In 2 rows she could fit roughly 2 weeks of firewood in there, protected from the weather, below floor level, temperature stabilized by the earth around it, no snow, no rain, no wet canvas. And if she cut a small opening at the corner of whatever cover she put over the channel, just where it met the back wall near the stove, she could direct the heat from the stove into the channel space. Warm air circulating through the stored wood, drying any moisture that did manage to get in, then rising back into the main living space. She wasn't just solving the wet wood problem. She was turning a drainage channel into a combined wood storage unit and heat distribution system, using gravity for drainage, using heat for drying, using the same principles that have been directing water and warmth through structures for 2,000 years, applied to 9 feet of Dakota clay by a 16-year-old girl on the 3rd night of a smoky firewood problem. She did not sit there thinking about grand principles. She sat there thinking this will work. Then she stood up and went to find Hasp's lumber yard in the morning. She bought 8 feet of 1x12 pine board, 80 cents. She had it ripped into 3-inch widths at the yard. Hasp's apprentice did it without comment, which was its own kind of progress, and she spent the evening cutting and fitting sections to cover the drainage channel. She made the cover in modules, each section 2 feet long, fitted together end to end, lying flat across the channel like a very low floor, each section removable independently so she could access different parts of the channel depending on which wood she needed first. Where the boards met the clay walls, she sealed the gaps with the clay grass mortar she'd used on the window. No gaps, no drafts, no entry point for moisture. She cut the small opening at the back corner maybe 4 inches across and positioned it at the level where warm air from the stove could travel into the channel space and circulate. She tested it with a lit candle, held the flame at the entrance of the channel opening, and watched the flame lean into the channel. The air was moving, going in warm, would come out dry. Then she loaded the channel, split cottonwood section lengths stacked in 2 tight rows, laid the board covers over them, walked across the covers, solid, stable, no flex. You couldn't tell there was wood under there unless you knew to look. She stood in the middle of her floor and looked down and felt something she could not entirely name. Not pride exactly, something more specific than pride. the satisfaction of a problem that fought back and lost, the satisfaction of a solution that came not from more resources, but from a longer look at the resources already there. The drainage channel had been built to move water. It was now also storing wood, drying wood, and distributing heat. One thing, 3 functions, 0 additional materials beyond the pine board. Her father would have liked that. He had always said that the best solutions weren't the ones that added the most. They were the ones that used what was already there. She checked the temperature of the wood in the channel the next morning. Dry, ready to burn. It worked. December arrived the way December always arrived in Dakota Territory, without ceremony, without warning beyond what you should have already been preparing for, without patience for anyone who hadn't gotten ready. The temperature dropped to 18 below zero on the 22nd and stayed below zero for the next 11 days. 11 consecutive days below zero. The kind of cold where the trees cracked like rifle shots at 3 in the morning ice, expanding in the wood until something gave. The kind of cold where exposed skin went numb in under a minute, and frostbite was not a distant concern, but an immediate one. The kind of cold where you looked at your firewood supply at the end of day 3 and felt a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. Desse closed the dining hall for a week. Nobody could get the building warm enough to serve food in. The stove ran all day, and the heat left through the walls as fast as it was made, because frame buildings were good at many things, and holding heat in 18 below was not one of them. Families in town burned through their winter wood supply twice as fast as they'd planned. Hasp himself went through 2 full cords in the first 2 weeks. He'd been planning for a cord and a half. He had to send his apprentice out to the woodlot at 10 below to cut more, and green cut wood doesn't burn the way seasoned wood burns, and the smoke that came out of his chimney in those weeks was a particular color that meant the wood was not fully cooperating. Norcut Fane was burning fence posts by Christmas. Fence posts. Because the firewood was gone and the fence posts were wooden and the alternative was too cold to think about. Mabry burned half of what she'd expected to burn. Half. Because the dugout didn't leak heat the way a frame house did. The surrounding earth held warmth for hours after the stove had cooled, the way it had held summer warmth through that first May night. She fired the stove in the morning, brought the inside temperature to 68 degrees, and the earth held that warmth while the outside raged and cracked and froze everything it could reach. The wood in her covered channel stayed bone dry, stayed at ambient earth temperature, which meant it didn't freeze solid the way wood piled outside did. When she pulled pieces to burn, they caught fast and burned hot. Dry seasoned cottonwood burns like it means it. None of the hissing and spitting of wet wood. None of the smoke that didn't know whether it was going up or out. Just clean heat fast and certain the way she needed it. She was burning half and staying warmer. Desse came on the 28th of December, which was the 7th day of the sustained cold. She arrived in the late afternoon, wrapped in everything she owned, and she stood inside Mabry's entrance and did not move for almost a full minute. Mabry watched her. Desse was looking at the temperature, not a thermometer. She didn't have one. She was looking at the fact that Mabry was sitting at her table without a coat on, without extra layers, in December, in Dakota Territory, with 18 below happening 20 yards away. "How warm is it in here?" Desse asked. 62, maybe 63. I haven't fired the stove since this morning." Desse looked at the cover channel, at the floor that was not apparently a floor all the way through. That's the wood storage. And the heat channel. The warm air from the stove circulates through the wood to dry it. then rises back up into the room. Daisy stood with that information for a moment. Then she looked at Mabry, really looked at her, the way she had not quite looked at her since the morning Mabry had walked through her door with a trunk and 2 dresses and hands the color of old brick. I told you dugouts were for desperate men who didn't know any better. Yes, I was wrong about what you were building, not wrong about everything, not wrong to be cautious, not wrong to worry, just wrong about the specific thing, which was exactly the kind of admission Desse would make precise, honest, no more than the evidence required. Mabry nodded. Desse looked around the room once more, the shelves with their organized supplies, the rope bed with its wool blanket, the small window with its cracked pane showing a slice of late afternoon sky, the stove still warm from its morning fire. You have surplus wood, Dessa said. It wasn't quite a question. Some. The Granberry family is short. The children are young. The Granberry family, the ones Father Press had suggested she hire herself out to back in March. The proper situation, the Christian charity on both sides. How short are they? Another week's worth would see them through. Mabry was quiet, doing math. She had 2 weeks of surplus in the channel, maybe more, depending on how the next stretch went. 1 week given away left her with 1 week of cushion. Not comfortable, but not dangerous either. I'll send it over in the morning, she said. Desse looked at her with an expression that Mabry couldn't entirely read, something complicated in it, something that might have been the beginning of a revision, not of her opinion of Mabry, which had been quietly shifting since August, but of something larger, of what was possible, of what a person who had been given almost nothing could build with just the knowledge in her head and the work in her hands. Thank you, Dessa said, which was 2 words she did not use carelessly. She left. Mabry watched her go. Then she went and checked the wood level in the channel, did the math, and started planning the delivery route for the next morning. Word got out. This is how it always happened on the frontier, not through newspapers or formal announcements, through the conversations that happen when families are cold and someone mentions in passing that the Eidson girl out at Apple Creek has dry wood and the Granberry children are warm because of it, and if you went out there, she might have something to trade. By the 2nd week of January, Mabry was trading firewood to 5 different families. She did not take advantage. She was very deliberate about that. She understood in a way that 16-year-olds are not always given credit for understanding that the value of what she had came not just from the wood itself, but from the trust of the people she traded with. Price gouge once, and the trust was gone. Trade fairly, and it compounded. So she traded fairly. A week's worth of dry cottonwood and ash for whatever a family had to offer at fair value. She came back with smoked ham and cornmeal and preserved beans and 6 pounds of oats from Fane, who looked at her bone-dry split wood like she was handing him something impossible, and then went inside and came back with more food than she'd expected. More than 2 weeks of wages at the dining hall, for wood she'd cut herself, from trees that grew free along a creek she didn't own, and stored dry in a channel she'd built for drainage. A jar of rendered lard came from a family she barely knew, 3 children and a sled, and a look on the father's face that said he had chosen carefully and hoped this was the right door. It was. She gave them 2 weeks of wood and charged nothing because the children were small, and she could see in his face that he had nothing to trade that she'd be comfortable taking. She did not tell anyone about that particular transaction. Some things didn't need to be part of the record. Dessa found out anyway, because Dessa found out everything eventually. She came on a Tuesday in late January, the way she always came, without announcement, without particular reason stated, just appearing at the doorway with her coat on and her arms crossed and her face doing the thing it did when she was processing something she hadn't entirely resolved yet. She stepped inside. She looked at the shelves, the organization of the supplies, the careful stacking of the remaining wood visible through the open channel section. The Granberry wood, she said. Yes, Arne Roos as well, I heard. I had enough. You had the edge of enough. That's still enough. Dessa was quiet for a moment. You could be charging more, she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation from a businesswoman who understood market conditions and was noting a discrepancy. I could. You're choosing not to. I'm choosing not to. Another pause. The stove ticked. Outside, a wind picked up briefly and then died. Your father taught you that too, Desse asked. Mabry thought about it, about Carveth Mull, about a man who had built chicken coops for neighbors who couldn't pay him and hadn't complained about it and hadn't held it over anyone and had just gone home and built the next thing that needed building. I think so, she said, not in words. Dessa nodded, a single slow nod that meant she understood that kind of teaching exactly, the kind that doesn't use words, the kind that uses behavior and expects the child to be watching. They sat in the warm dugout for a while, not saying much, which was Mabry had come to understand exactly how Desse Rude showed that she trusted you, not with declarations, not with gestures, with her presence in your space and her willingness to be quiet in it. It was, she thought, not unlike the earth itself, patient, steady, warm in ways that didn't announce themselves. Hasp came on the 15th of January. She saw him from the window first, the shape of him on the road, too well dressed for the cold, moving at a pace that said purposeful rather than casual, moving toward her, not past her. She had a fairly good idea what this was. He knocked at the door frame. The door was already open. She'd been airing the space, which you could do even in deep cold if you did it briefly, and closed up fast. Miss Eadson? Mr. Hasp. He looked past her into the interior. His eyes went to the covered channel, to the stove ticking quietly in the corner, to the temperature, which was, she could see him feeling it on his face, considerably warmer than 18 below. I'm told you have dry firewood. I do. I'd like to purchase some. She named a price, fair market rate, not a cent more. He agreed immediately, which told her he'd been expecting to pay more and had prepared for negotiation that wasn't coming. She pulled the board sections off the channel, reached in and pulled out split cotton wood, pale dry, the wood fibers clean and tight. She stacked it on the hand sled she used for deliveries. Haas watched the operation, watched the channel being uncovered, watched the orderly storage, the section access, the way the whole system worked from a single small design decision made on the third night of a smoky firewood problem. He was quiet for a long time. Then, and she was watching, she noticed this. She filed it away with everything else she'd been filing. He reached out and placed his hand flat against the interior clay wall. Just for a moment, the way you test a surface to understand it, the way her father had taught her to read walls and ground and wood by touch. Then he paid her and left. She watched him go from the doorway. She did not smile. She was not the kind of person who smiled at vindication when the vindication was this quiet and this private and this much in the middle of still needing to get through the rest of the winter. But she felt something, standing there in the cold doorway with warm air at her back. She felt it, and she went back inside to bank the stove for the night, Orvin Eidson came on the 18th of January. She hadn't seen him since the morning he'd pointed at the horizon and told her to make her own way. She didn't know he was coming. There was no way to know. He hadn't sent word, hadn't asked anyone to tell her. He just appeared on the road in the late afternoon, pulling a hand sled moving toward the creek with the particular gait of a man who has been told something is somewhere and is going to find it. She saw him from the window. Her breath went strange for a moment. Something happened in her chest. Not pain exactly, but the memory of pain, which is its own kind of sensation. She sat with it for a second, 1 second. Then she got up and opened the door. He stopped when he saw her. His face did something complicated. Recognition, then something else, surprise maybe, or the thing that comes after surprise, when the surprise is about something you didn't want to be surprised by. He hadn't known it was her door. He'd been told there was a girl out at Apple Creek selling dry wood. He'd come because his cabin roof had a gap he hadn't been able to fix before the cold hit, and the wood he'd stacked against the north wall had been freezing solid overnight and burning like it wanted to prove him wrong about wood. He hadn't known it was her. They looked at each other. The wind moved between them, cold and indifferent. Mabry's hand was on the door frame. The hammer was in her coat pocket, the way it always was. She felt its weight there, familiar, her father's, hers. She thought about Prudence for just a moment, about the 4 years of Sunday smiles, about how a lie cost Mabry a home and a mother and a winter on frozen ground, and had gotten Prudence nothing. Not the hammer, not the land, not anything except the knowledge that she had done a thing that could not be undone. She did not close the door. "How much do you need?" she asked. His jaw worked. "A week's worth, maybe 10 days. "I have it." She turned back inside, pulled the board sections off the channel, loaded the hand sled methodically, without rushing, without looking at him more than necessary. Split cottonwood, pale and dry, the same wood she'd cut from the same grove she'd been cutting from all year, stored in the same channel she'd built from a drainage ditch on a night when wet wood was smoking up her space, and she'd needed to look at the problem from a different angle. She named the price, fair market, not a cent more, not a cent less. He paid. He didn't speak, didn't look at her face directly. He looked at the wood, at the sled, at the entrance of the dugout behind her, which was warm enough that she was standing in the open door without shivering. She could see him putting it together, the warmth, the dry wood, the organization of it, the fact that his stepdaughter, whom he had put out into 14 below cold with $4 and a trunk, was standing here in February, having clearly survived and more than survived, and was now the person he had come to for help. He picked up the sled rope. He walked back toward town without another word. She stood in the doorway and watched him go until the road curved and he was out of sight. Then she went back inside, sat down at her table, looked at the hammer on the shelf above the drainage channel. She sat with the quiet. Outside, the wind moved across the prairie, across the sod roof above her head, across the territory that had been trying in various ways to make her leave since February of the previous year. She was still here. He was gone, dragging a sled of her wood back to a cabin with a broken roof. She thought about whether she was angry. She checked. Honestly, she wasn't. Not exactly. What she felt was more like completion, the way a sentence feels when it has been finished, when the thing that needed to be said has been said and there's nothing left to argue about. She had been put out. She had built something. He had come to her for help. She had given it, not because she forgave him, not because what he'd done had been acceptable, but because the transaction required by justice was exactly that. He needed what she had. She had it. She gave it at fair price and he paid. Nothing owed, nothing outstanding. She was done. The cold broke on the 4th of February. Bismarck exhaled. People came out of their houses looking slightly stunned, blinking, taking inventory of what they still had and what they'd lost. Firewood piles that had been generous in October were gone or down to splinters. The Fane fence line had a gap where the posts had been burned. Hasp's premium lumber stack had a water line on it from the December flooding that he'd spent 2 weeks pretending wasn't there. And 3 miles west of town, along Apple Creek, Mabry walked out of her earth shelter in the February morning, stood in the cold air that now felt almost mild by comparison, and looked at what she still had. Half her wood supply, intact, 55 degrees inside without a fire, one cracked window pane still holding. The sod roof had compressed over the winter, settled down, and thickened the grass roots, deepening into the layer below the whole structure, bonding to itself, the way living things do when left alone to do what they're designed to do. It looked, if anything, more permanent than it had in October. She had been right, not about everything, but about the thing that mattered, and now everyone knew it, whether they were ready to say so or not. February ended, March arrived, and then Hasp came back. Not for wood this time. He came on a Tuesday morning in late February, which was unusual because Hasp was a man who conducted business in the afternoons when the light was better and the cold was slightly less aggressive. Tuesday morning meant this was not a routine purchase. He knocked at the door frame. She was already at the table with her newspaper records, doing end-of-season accounting. "Miss Eidson, I have a proposal." She put down the pencil, waited. He came inside, looked around the space with the particular attention of a man who had been thinking about something for a while and was now checking his mental model against reality. "The temperature differential," he said. "How consistent is it year-round? Summer outside 95, inside 68. Winter outside -18, inside around 55. Without a fire, 68, with one firing of the stove per day." He looked at the walls, which were smooth and hard and had not crumbled. "The moisture problem I described. The drainage system handles it. The collapse risk. The wall angle handles that. 10 degrees inward. The clay compacts to load-bearing density when you tamp it correctly." He was quiet, going through his list, the list he'd given her at the counter in March, the 4 reasons this would fail, checking them against what was in front of him. 3 of the 4 were standing here, warm and dry and intact. "I have a storage problem," he said. "Merchants in this territory lose substantial inventory to temperature extremes. Root vegetables freeze in winter, grain sprouts or molds in summer, fabric warps, preserved goods fail. What I need," he paused, choosing words carefully, "what the Bismarck merchant community needs is a temperature-stable storage structure, something that maintains between 50 and 60 degrees year-round without constant heating or cooling." Mabry looked at him. He looked at her. She had known since January, since the hand on the wall, that this conversation was coming. She had been doing the numbers in her head. "You're describing what I built," she said. "Yes, but larger. Considerably. 20 feet wide, 30 feet deep, 12 feet at the entrance." She thought about the scale. The drainage system at that dimension, multiple channels each, running the length of the structure, all graded toward a single exit point. The sod roof spanning 30 feet required heavier framing, more poles, more careful load distribution. Not impossible, more complex. I'll need labor for the excavation, she said. I can't do that volume and maintain my dining hall shifts. I'll pay for labor. I choose who I hire. A beat. Agreed. I want $2 a week during construction and a percentage of whatever you charge for storage once it's operational. He looked at her. She was 17 years old. She had just negotiated with him the way people twice her age negotiated, clearly, without hedging, knowing what she wanted and not apologizing for it. 15%, he said. 20, 17, 18, done. She picked up her pencil and wrote the number in the margin of her newspaper page. We break ground in March, she said. She hired Orwick Callahan. He was 28, a stonemason from Illinois who had come west looking for work and found that the territory had more land than it had people who knew what to do with it. She'd met him through Father Prest, who had introduced them in passing. He had good hands. He understood materials. When she explained what they were building and why he didn't argue or question or list reasons, it would fail. He listened, asked 2 precise questions about the drainage grade and the sod layering sequence. She answered them. When do we start? He said. They broke ground in the first week of March, 1879. The earth was still partially frozen, but not as deep as the previous year. She'd learned from that planned her fire and thaw rotation more efficiently. Callahan was methodical and strong and picked up her techniques faster than she'd expected. He watched her tamp a wall section, did it himself, checked her face for confirmation, and when she nodded, he moved on without needing to be told again. The excavation took 3 weeks. The framing took 2 more. The sod work took another week and a half. They finished in the second week of May, 1879, exactly 1 year after she'd moved into her own dugout. The commercial storage dugout opened in June. Hasp charged 15 cents per week for a storage space 4 feet square. By July, he had 12 customers: seed potatoes, preserved meat, bolts of fabric, canned goods, apples. The apples were significant. A merchant named Witter had lost 30% of his apple supply the previous 2 winters, frozen solid in the frame storage shed he'd been using. The first winter in the dugout, he lost less than 5%. He stood at the entrance in September, looking at his inventory like a man who has been told a simple fact that changes a complicated calculation he'd been making wrong for years. How, he said. Constant temperature, Mabry said. The earth doesn't vary the way air does, cold enough to slow spoilage, warm enough to prevent freezing. Why doesn't everyone do this? She thought about Hasp at the counter with his 4 reasons, Fane on the horse with no answer, Prest outside the church with his concern. They will, she said, eventually. Father Prest came to see the commercial dugout in July. He came alone on a weekday afternoon, and he walked through the whole structure. The way he walked through situations he was reassessing, carefully paying attention without rushing to conclusions. He ran his hand along the compacted clay wall, tested the floor grade with his boot, looked up at the sod ceiling, felt the temperature, which was as always steady and cool in the summer heat outside. Then he came out and stood in the July sun and looked at Mabry. I told you that pride was one sin, he said, but foolishness was worse. You did. I've been thinking about that, about whether what you did was foolishness or something else. She waited. I think I was wrong about the category, he said. What you did wasn't prideful, and it wasn't foolish. It was, he paused, searching for the word studied. You understood something I didn't understand, and you were right to trust that understanding even when I was certain you were wrong. It was the most complete thing anyone had said to her about any of it. She stood in the July heat and felt something move through her chest that was not triumph and not relief and not vindication. It was something quieter than all of those. It was the feeling of being seen accurately, of having someone look at what you did and describe it correctly, not as luck, not as stubbornness, as knowledge applied with precision and held under pressure until it proved itself. "Thank you, Father," she said. He nodded once, looked at the hillside, at the grass growing on the roof. "Your father," he said, "he taught you this. The principles, yes. He would have been." He paused, didn't finish, didn't need to. He walked back to town. She watched him go. Then she sat down on the low stone wall at the entrance and let herself be still for a minute. She reached into her coat pocket and wrapped her hand around the hammer. March 1878. A frozen road, a trunk, a hammer, $4. March 1879. A commercial structure, a percentage agreement, 12 customers storing everything from seed grain to bolts of fabric in a structure that the ground itself kept cool and constant. 1 year, 11 months to be precise. The hammer was not heavy. It was a working tool balanced for a hand slightly larger than hers, her father's hand. She had grown into it partly, not entirely. Maybe she never would entirely, but it was hers, had been hers since before anyone decided otherwise, was still hers now on the other side of everything that had been tried to take it. She sat with the July heat on her face and the cool air drifting out from the entrance at her back, and for the first time since February of 1878, since the morning she'd stood on a frozen road with everything she owned and started calculating, she was not calculating. She was just sitting, with the sun on her face and the weight of a hammer in her hand and the knowledge that the ground beneath her, slow thinking and faithful as it always had been, had kept every promise it had ever made. Callahan stayed. He built 6 more dugouts in the Bismarck area over the following 2 years using the techniques Mabry had developed. He was precise about attribution. He told everyone who asked who had designed the system, who had worked out the drainage grades and the sod sequencing and the covered thermal channel, who had built the first one on $9.45 and a dead man's principles. By 1881, there were 14 earth shelters in the Bismarck area and into the surrounding Dakota Territory, all of them built on variations of what she had worked out alone on that creek bank. The drainage principle, the sod layering, the covered channel, 14 structures that stayed warm in winter and cool in summer and didn't burn through a season's firewood supply in 6 weeks. She filed her homestead claim that year, 160 acres along Apple Creek, including the bank where she dug her first hole. The land was hers now, formally, legally, in writing. She stood at the county recorder's office and signed the papers and walked out into the November morning with a deed in her coat pocket alongside the hammer, both of them hers, both of them earned. In June of 1882, she married a man named Eric Svensson, Norwegian immigrant, wheat farmer, quiet in the way that Mabry had come to appreciate, not absence of thought, but the kind of quietness that comes from having things figured out enough that you don't need to narrate them constantly. He had been farming the stretch north of Apple Creek for 2 years, had seen the commercial dugout, had asked Callahan about it, and had come to introduce himself with a directness that she recognized immediately as its own form of respect. He did not tell her she was brave, did not tell her what she'd accomplished was remarkable, for a woman, or remarkable for her age, or remarkable given the circumstances. He asked her how the covered channel maintained its temperature through winter. She explained. He asked a follow-up question that showed he'd understood the first answer and was extending the logic. She answered that too. They were married 6 months later. In 1883, they built a frame house, proper construction, pitched roof, 2 rooms, and a sleeping loft. She helped design it, paying particular attention to the foundation drainage and the placement of the stove relative to the stone chimney. It was a good house, solid, but they kept the dugout, not as a ruin, not as a curiosity, as a working storage structure, the covered channel keeping supplies dry, the earth preserving what they put there, the drainage system directing every drop of moisture away from the things they needed to keep. She went in there sometimes in winter when the frame house was demanding more wood than she'd like, and the cold was doing its Dakota thing outside. She went in and sat on the old rope bed frame, which she'd kept because it was useful and because she'd built it herself and it had earned its place. The temperature in there was always steady, always exactly what the earth said it would be. In 1885, Father Callum Prest wrote a letter to his bishop. He was writing about frontier settlement practices, about what he'd learned in his years in Dakota Territory, about the gap between what people expected and what actually worked, about the difference between knowledge that came from repetition and knowledge that came from observation. He wrote about Mabry. He wrote it plainly, the way a man writes when he's trying to be honest without performing honesty. He wrote, "She understood this land better than men twice her age, and experience myself included. I offered her charity when she needed none. I cautioned her with authority I did not have, and she was kind enough to prove me wrong without requiring me to be embarrassed about it. That is a kind of grace I had not thought to teach about." She read that line 3 times when the letter surfaced in the Bismarck archives years later. A kind of grace I had not thought to teach about. She thought about Orvin, about the hand sled and the fair price and the walk back to town. She thought about Hasp and the hand on the wall and the 18% written in the margin of a newspaper page. She thought about Dessa and the linen bandage and the 2 words she did not use carelessly. Grace, maybe, or something that looked like it from the outside. From the inside, it had felt more like arithmetic, like understanding that the way you treat people in a transaction shapes what the transaction is worth, and that some transactions you make not for what you get back, but for what you want to be the kind of person who does. Her father had taught her that, not in words, in the way he built chicken coops for neighbors who couldn't pay and came home and didn't mention it. The Bismarck commercial dugout operated for 35 years. The original on Apple Creek stood until at least 1904. Photographs from around 1898 show the sod roof indistinguishable from the hillside itself, prairie grass grown thick across it, a frame addition built onto the front entrance by whoever lived there later, a hybrid structure, earth and wood, old principle, new material. The drainage ditch in the photograph is deeper than she dug it. 20 years of spring thaw had worn it smooth and wide, the water following the grade she'd established and deepening it year by year. The cracked window pane is visible in the photograph, still there, still holding. The last documented record of Mabry Svensson appears in a census from 1920. She was 58 years old. Her occupation was listed as farm woman. No mention of the dugouts, no mention of the families who stayed warm because of the wood she traded, no mention of Callahan structures or the 14 total or the commercial operation or the Witter merchant and his apples or the letter father pressed wrote that called her knowledge grace. No mention of the hammer, farm woman, which is, if you think about it, exactly what she was. A woman who understood the farm, who understood the earth, who understood that the ground beneath your feet is not your enemy if you learn how it thinks, who understood that the slow things, the earth, the seasons, the patient accumulation of what you've actually observed outlast the fast things every single time, who understood at 16 standing on a frozen road with $4 in a trunk and her dead father's hammer that the question was not whether she would survive. The question was what she would build. And that is not just frontier history. That is what it looks like when someone chooses observation over assumption, when they trust what they've felt with their own hands over what they've been told to believe, when they hold to what they know is true, even when everyone around them is entirely certain they are wrong. Somewhere in Dakota Territory, there is a hillside. The structure beneath it has been gone for over a century. The sod dissolved back into the earth it came from. The cottonwood poles rotted, as cottonwood does. The stones of the front wall scattered or were taken for other purposes, but the drainage ditch is still there, worn deep and smooth by 140 years of spring runoff, following the grade that a 16-year-old girl established on a cold morning in 1878 because she understood that water given the right path will always go where you ask it to. The earth is still exactly what it was at 8 feet down, slow, patient, faithful, exactly as promised.